My name is Mahasan Chaney. I am an assistant professor of education here at Brown. This semester, I have been writing my first book manuscript, tentatively titled Disciplining Opportunity. This manuscript is a cultural and intellectual history that traces the making of punitive school discipline practices through a study of opportunity policies and discourses that I argue make racial equality contingent on education and educational success. My primary research goal is to give greater context for understanding practices of school punishment, the policies that gave rise to and informed zero tolerance policies of the 1990s, and to historicize the fact that Black students remain the primary subjects of school discipline and punishment. I do this by examining both schools as disciplining institutions that control and at times are meant to try to prevent tougher forms of punishment. But I'm also interested in school discipline, that is the making of school rules, and over time, increasingly more punitive school rules. Since the civil rights upheavals of the 1960s, education, once hailed as the primary purveyor of racial and economic opportunity, has instead controlled, punished, and funneled children through what critics call the school-to-prison pipeline. The consequences have been especially dire, again, for Black children who attend schools that are less funded and more heavily policed and are overwhelmingly subject to disproportionately more punitive disciplinary policies. So most contemporary studies tend to locate the origins of this punitive turn in education reform to the rising policies of neoliberalism in the 1980s, the founding of federal zero tolerance policies in the 1990s, which did increase police in schools and help to fund more tools of surveillance. Disciplining opportunity, by contrast, traces this pattern back to an earlier period during what I see as an educational war on poverty. The war on poverty in the 1960s funded a series of programs and legislations that were meant to combat these high rates of increasing poverty. Though historians have usually framed the education agenda of this period in terms of equity policies, they have missed the era's focus on order and discipline and the continuity of these underlying goals. So in the 1960s, policymakers used what I call opportunity policies. These are things like Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. People may be more familiar with the reauthorization of that form. So No Child Left Behind, everyone is like living in this No Child Left Behind era. But they were also programs like early childhood education, Head Start, job training programs. So all of these fall under this bucket of what I see as opportunity policies in education. And throughout the manuscript, I kind of argue that amidst these urban unrest and delinquency threats, these opportunity policies were also used to combat racialized fear of urban delinquency through interventions in public schooling. And in doing so, they relied on and produced this long-range strategy of rationalizing discipline education reforms and relying on paternalizing language about Black children and their families, and framing education as a federal panacea for their supposedly deficit culture. Forged during the 1960s civil rights activism and the spectacular urban social unrest, this approach has shaped most federal education policy since and helped drive the push for more disciplined, ordered, and punitive reforms. My next steps are to continue working through the chapters of this larger manuscript. And ultimately, I hope to provide a critical historical understanding of the making of more punitive school rules. But also, I want to think about the consequences of putting our faith in an education system to meet out the goals of racism and poverty. I want to argue that we now have the opportunity to move beyond an education politics that's focused on creating responsible students and to instead embrace the responsibility to think beyond education as the sole panacea for economic equity and anti-racism.